The road to Black Hollow twisted through dense woods, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. The afternoon sun barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting the path in eerie, shifting shadows. Eleanor Marlowe gripped the steering wheel, her eyes flitting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the back seat. She forced herself to take a deep breath. It was just her imagination, the product of too many sleepless nights and the haunting memories of a life she was trying to leave behind. Black Hollow hadn't changed much since she last visited as a child. It was a town caught in time, its old Victorian houses standing like stern guardians of secrets long buried. Eleanor's ancestral home was one of the oldest. Perched on the edge of the woods, it had always unsettled her, even during those summer visits years ago. Now, returning to it alone, the house seemed to exhale a breath of cold, stale air, as if aware of her presence. The townspeople watched from their doorsteps as Eleanor drove by. Their gazes were wary, cautious. She caught glimpses of them through her window, eyes narrowing, heads turning to follow her car until it disappeared down the street. Eleanor felt a shiver creep up her spine. It was more than the usual small-town suspicion of outsiders. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone. When she finally pulled up to the house, it loomed before her, dark and imposing. Vines crawled up its stone facade, and the windows stared out like dead eyes. She hesitated before stepping out of the car, her breath clouding in the chill autumn air. She fumbled with the keys, the metal cold and heavy in her hand, before finally opening the front door. It creaked ominously, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Inside, the house was just as she remembered: heavy wooden furniture, faded wallpaper, and a sense of unease that seemed to seep from the very walls. Eleanor set down her bags in the foyer, her footsteps echoing loudly on the wooden floor. The air was stale, carrying the scent of dust and something else she couldn't quite place, a faint, acrid odor that made her nose wrinkle. As night fell, the house grew colder. Eleanor wrapped herself in a thick sweater and started a fire in the old stone fireplace. The flames flickered, casting shadows that danced across the room. She tried to settle into one of the armchairs, to read a book, to distract herself, but her eyes kept drifting to the darkened corners of the room. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched. It started with the footsteps. At first, she thought they were just the creaking of an old house settling in the cold, but as the night wore on, they became more distinct. Slow, deliberate steps that moved across the floor above her. Eleanor held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps paused, then resumed, coming closer to the staircase. She grabbed the flashlight from the side table, her hands trembling as she turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty hallway. She forced herself to her feet and crept toward the stairs, her breath catching in her throat. With each step, the air grew colder, until she could see her breath misting in the light. The second floor was empty. Eleanor swept the flashlight across the hallway, her nerves frayed. She checked each room, expecting to find some intruder, some rational explanation. But there was nothing, only silence and the oppressive sense of being watched. As she turned to go back downstairs, she heard it. A whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Eleanor froze, her blood running cold. She strained to hear, her mind racing. Was it the wind? The house settling? Or something else entirely? The whisper grew louder, more insistent, a susurration that made her skin prickle. It was not words, not exactly, but a sound that conveyed meaning nonetheless, a warning, a plea, or a threat. Eleanor stumbled back, her hand gripping the banister. She hurried down the stairs, her heart in her throat, and slammed the door to the living room behind her. She leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of unease remained, clinging to her like a second skin. She told herself it was just the isolation, the stress of the move, the memories of her past chasing her into this old house. But deep down, she knew it was something more. The following days brought little respite. The townspeople avoided her eyes when she ventured into the market for supplies. Conversations hushed when she approached, replaced by strained smiles and terse nods. The whispers in her house continued, growing bolder, more defined. She would hear them late at night, just as she was on the verge of sleep. Soft voices that carried through the walls, whispering her name. Eleanor. Sleep became a luxury. Each night she lay awake in bed, the covers pulled up to her chin, listening to the whispers. They seemed to come from the woods, drifting through the trees and into her room. Sometimes they sounded pleading, other times angry. Always they filled her with a dread that kept her rooted in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, Eleanor decided to confront the whispers. She couldn't live in fear, not again. She armed herself with the flashlight and an old kitchen knife, more for comfort than for any real protection. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, as if beckoning her to the woods behind the house. She stepped out into the night, the air biting and cold. The flashlight's beam wavered as she moved through the yard, the trees at the edge of the woods looming like dark sentinels. The whispers were all around her now, circling her, seeping into her mind. Eleanor. Eleanor ... They seemed to pull at her, guiding her steps toward a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. Eleanor hesitated at the path's entrance. The darkness beyond was thick, impenetrable, and the trees twisted into grotesque shapes under the pale moonlight. She took a step forward, then another, the whispers growing louder, urging her on. Just as she was about to cross into the tree line, a gust of wind rushed past her, freezing her in place. The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Eleanor stood there, breathless, waiting for something to happen. But the woods remained still, the path before her dark and silent. A sense of profound unease settled over her, as if she had narrowly avoided something terrible, something unspeakable. She turned back to the house, her steps quickening as she crossed the yard. The whispers didn't follow her, but their absence was almost worse. They had withdrawn, watching, waiting. As she closed the door behind her, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever haunted Black Hollow was not merely a figment of her imagination. It was real, and it was growing bolder. That night, as she lay in bed, sleep eluded her. The house was silent, unnervingly so. No whispers, no footsteps, just an oppressive quiet that pressed down on her chest. Eleanor stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of the woods, of the whispers, of the townspeople's wary gazes. The feeling of being watched had not left her. It was stronger now, more palpable. And then, just as she was beginning to drift into an uneasy sleep, she heard it again. A single whisper, clear and chilling, coming from the darkness beside her bed. Eleanor. Her eyes snapped open, but she did not turn her head. She could feel it now. A presence, something standing just beyond the edge of the bed, watching her with eyes that burned in the darkness. This time it was not a plea or a warning. It was a promise. Eleanor lay still, her body rigid with fear, her mind teetering on the brink of panic. The darkness seemed to press in around her, heavy and suffocating. And as the night stretched on, the whispering began anew, filling the room with a cacophony of voices that spoke of things she was not ready to understand. The quiet town of Black Hollow was not quiet at all. It was alive with secrets, with whispers that carried the weight of centuries. And as Eleanor lay there, paralyzed by fear, she knew that the worst was yet to come. The morning after the whispers called her name, Eleanor woke up to an unsettling silence. The house, which had felt oppressive and full of hidden eyes the night before, now seemed almost mundane in the daylight. The whispers had stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving behind a void that made her skin crawl. It was as if they were simply waiting for the right moment to return, watching her from the corners of every room. Eleanor knew she couldn't continue living in the shadow of fear. She needed answers. After a restless breakfast, she grabbed her coat and headed into town, determined to learn more about Black Hollow and the secrets it held. The old library seemed like the best place to start. If there was any record of the town's past, it would be there. The library was a relic from another era, its Gothic architecture casting long shadows over the cobblestone street. Inside, the smell of old paper and dust greeted her, along with the piercing gaze of the librarian, Mrs. Winthrop, an elderly woman with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through Eleanor. "I'm looking for information on the town's history," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady under the woman's scrutiny. Mrs. Winthrop's eyes narrowed, her expression tightening. "Black Hollow's past is better left buried," she replied, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Why dig up things best forgotten?" Eleanor bristled at the response. "I need to know what's happening in my house. I hear things, whispers." The librarian's face paled, her gaze flicking around the room as if to ensure they were alone. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "The woods have their own secrets, child. Not everything in this town is meant to be understood." Before Eleanor could press further, Mrs. Winthrop gestured toward a dusty section in the back corner. "The town records are there. Be careful what you seek." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine as she walked toward the back of the library. The air grew colder, and the dim lighting cast eerie shadows across the old wooden shelves. The section was filled with leather-bound volumes, some crumbling with age. She ran her fingers along the spines, searching for anything that might shed light on the whispers and the town's dark history. After what felt like hours, she found it. A book bound in cracked black leather with no title on its spine. Inside, the pages were filled with accounts of the town's early years, settler stories, founding families, and finally the tale of Margaret Wainwright. The Witch of Black Hollow. Margaret was not the malevolent figure that the town's legends had made her out to be. According to the accounts, she was a healer, someone the townsfolk had turned to in times of need. But as the story went, fear and superstition had taken hold. A series of unexplained deaths had been blamed on her, and soon, whispers of witchcraft spread through the town like wildfire. In a frenzy of fear, they accused her of consorting with dark forces. The final pages described her execution in grim detail. She was dragged into the woods, bound to a tree, and burned alive. With her dying breath, she cursed the town, vowing that Black Hollow would never know peace. Eleanor's hands shook as she read the last line. The curse. It had to be connected to the whispers, to the feeling of being watched. But why was it her house? What did Margaret's death have to do with her family? She turned to leave when a folded piece of parchment fell out from the back of the book. Eleanor picked it up carefully. It was an old map of Black Hollow, but this one was different. It marked a location deep within the woods behind her house, a place called Wainwright's Hollow. At the edge of the map was a handwritten note. "The truth lies within the hollow. Seek at your peril." Eleanor's heart pounded as she folded the map and tucked it into her coat pocket. The woods had always been the epicenter of her fear, the source of the whispers. She felt a grim resolve settle over her. She would go there. She had to, but not yet. That night, the whispers returned, stronger and more coherent than ever. They spoke in fragments, words that slipped through her mind like shadows. Names, places, warnings. Eleanor sat in the darkened living room, the fire in the hearth offering little warmth against the chill that had settled over the house. She opened the old family journal she had found in the attic days before. It had belonged to her great-great-grandmother. a stern woman whose portrait still hung in the upstairs hallway. The journal was filled with mundane entries about daily life, but as she flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. Her ancestor had written about Margaret Wainwright, how she had feared her, how she had been one of those who called for her death. Eleanor's fingers traced the words on the page. Her family had been part of the mob that condemned Margaret, and not just any part. Her great-great-grandmother had been the one to cast the first stone, to light the first flame. The guilt was palpable in the writing, the fear of retribution. There were mentions of strange occurrences even then, whispers in the night, shadows that moved of their own accord. The journal ended abruptly with a final entry written in a trembling hand. She will not rest. We are bound to her fate. A gust of cold air swept through the room, extinguishing the fire. Eleanor jumped, the journal slipping from her grasp. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices surrounding her. She could feel them closing in, pressing against her, a crowd of unseen specters. She backed away, bumping into the desk behind her. Her hand brushed against something cold and metal, the flashlight. She grabbed it, turning it on, the beam piercing the darkness. The room was empty, but the whispers persisted, filling her head with the jumble of voices. Desperate, she called out, "What do you want from me?" The whispers ceased, the silence so sudden it was like a blow. For a moment she thought they had gone, but then, from the darkness at the edge of the room, a single whisper broke through, clearer than before. Justice. The word echoed in her mind, leaving her breathless. The whispers resumed, but now they carried a different tone, a sense of urgency, of pleading. They were not threats, but cries for help. Eleanor sank to the floor, clutching the flashlight, her mind reeling. Margaret was not the malevolent force. She was the victim, a soul trapped in torment. As the dawn light filtered through the windows, Eleanor knew what she had to do. The map in her pocket seemed to pulse with a life of its own, urging her toward the hollow. She could feel the weight of the town's history pressing down on her, the collective guilt of generations. Her family had played a part in this curse, and now it was her burden to lift it. The whispers followed her throughout the day, quieter now but ever present. They guided her to the tools she would need: candles, salt, and the silver amulet she found among her ancestors' things in the hidden room. It was etched with symbols that matched those in the journal, protection sigils meant to ward off evil. Eleanor prepared for her journey into the woods, her fear giving way to a cold determination. She would confront whatever waited in the hollow, whatever had been calling to her all this time. She no longer feared the whispers. They were her allies now, urging her toward the truth. The real enemy was something else, something that had thrived on the town's fear and hatred, that had twisted Margaret's curse into a darkness that permeated every corner of Black Hollow. As night fell, Eleanor stood at the edge of the woods, the path to Wainwright's Hollow stretching out before her like an open wound in the earth. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches forming a tunnel that swallowed the moonlight. She could feel the air thicken, the temperature drop as she stepped forward, the whispers growing louder with each step. "Eleanor, come." They led her deeper into the forest, the map clutched tightly in her hand. The path twisted and turned, narrowing as she approached the hollow. The whispers became a low hum, a constant murmur that guided her through the darkness. The trees parted suddenly, revealing a clearing bathed in an unnatural silver light. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient oak, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like twisted fingers. At its base, a stone altar covered in moss and vines bore the marks of an old ritual, the symbols carved deep into the rock. Eleanor approached it slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. The whispers swirled around her, forming a vortex of sound. They spoke of betrayal, of injustice, of a promise that had yet to be fulfilled. She could feel Margaret's presence, the weight of her suffering pressing down on her like a physical force. Eleanor reached into her pocket, pulling out the amulet, and placed it on the altar. The ground beneath her trembled, and a gust of wind whipped through the clearing. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and for a moment Eleanor thought she saw her, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, shrouded in darkness, her eyes burning with an unearthly light. Justice! The word reverberated through the air, and Eleanor felt a surge of power rush through her. The amulet began to glow, its light spreading across the altar, tracing the symbols carved into the stone. The air crackled with energy, and the whispers turned into a roar, a cry of liberation. Eleanor stumbled back as the light intensified, filling the clearing with a blinding radiance. She shielded her eyes, her heart racing. The ground shook, and the ancient oak groaned as if it were alive. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and then, suddenly, they stopped. Silence fell over the hollow, heavy and profound. Eleanor opened her eyes, blinking against the afterimage of the light. The altar stood empty, the amulet gone. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. For the first time since her arrival, the woods were still. But Eleanor knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The true darkness, the malevolent force that had fed on the curse, was still out there, lurking in the shadows. The whispers had led her here, not just to free Margaret, but to prepare her for what was to come. As she turned to leave the hollow, Eleanor felt a presence beside her, a faint whisper in her ear. It was Margaret, her voice soft and sad. "Beware, child. The worst is yet to come." Eleanor walked back to the house, the path behind her closing as if it had never been there. The hollow was silent now, its secrets buried once more. But the fight was far from over. The true enemy had yet to reveal itself, and Eleanor could feel its eyes upon her, waiting. She was no longer just Eleanor Marlowe. She was part of something much older, much darker, and as the moon rose over Black Hollow, she knew that the final confrontation was drawing near. The whispers had spoken, and their words were a warning she could no longer ignore. The woods remained eerily silent after Eleanor's encounter at Wainwright's Hollow. As she walked back to her house, the air around her felt different, lighter, yet charged with an unsettling energy, as if something had shifted but not completely. The whispers had quieted, their persistent murmur now replaced by a tense stillness that followed her like a shadow. The calm before the storm. Eleanor knew there was more to uncover. Margaret's spirit had been guiding her, but to what end? What did Margaret mean when she whispered, "The worst is yet to come"? The answer, Eleanor feared, lay buried in the darkest corners of Black Hollow's history, and possibly within her own family's past. Her return to the house was greeted with the same oppressive silence that had greeted her on her first night. But now the silence carried a weight, as if the house itself was bracing for what was about to come. That night, Eleanor struggled to sleep. When she finally drifted off, it was not to peaceful dreams, but to a vivid nightmare. She found herself standing in the center of the old town square, the moon hanging low and blood-red in the sky. The townspeople surrounded her, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and anger. At the center of it all was Margaret Wainwright, her hands bound, her eyes burning with defiance. Eleanor felt her heart seize as she watched the scene unfold, as if she were both a spectator and a participant. The townspeople shouted accusations, witch, demon, bringer of death. Eleanor could feel their hatred, their fear, swirling around her like a dark cloud. Margaret's gaze locked onto Eleanor's, her eyes pleading, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Eleanor felt herself step forward, an arm rising, a voice, her voice, shouting with the crowd. The scene shifted, blurring and swirling like a disturbed reflection in water. Now she was standing in the woods, the scent of smoke thick in the air. Margaret was tied to the tree, flames licking at her feet. Eleanor could feel the heat, the terror, the injustice of it all coursing through her veins. "No!" Eleanor gasped, her voice strangled. She tried to reach out, to stop what was happening, but her body wouldn't respond. It was as if she was bound by invisible chains, forced to witness this horror. The flames roared higher, engulfing Margaret, yet her gaze never wavered. She stared into Eleanor's eyes, her mouth forming a single word: "Remember." Eleanor woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the acrid smell of smoke lingering in her nostrils. Her hands shook as she pushed herself upright, her heart hammering in her chest. It wasn't just a dream, it was a memory that did not belong to her, yet felt as real as her own. She was seeing Margaret's last moments, but more disturbingly, she was seeing them through the eyes of someone who had been there. She stumbled out of bed, the room spinning around her. She needed answers. There had to be something in the house, some clue that would explain what she had just experienced. The hidden room, the journal, the family heirlooms. It all pointed to a secret that had been buried for generations. Eleanor made her way to the attic, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The old journal she had found earlier was still there, lying open on the floor where she had left it. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. Near the end, she found an entry that she had overlooked before, written in a shaky hand. "She haunts us still. Every night I hear her cries, feel her burning gaze upon me. We tried to silence her, but the darkness we called forth was more than we could control. It watches, it waits, and it will consume us all." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The darkness wasn't just Margaret's curse, it was something far worse. The townspeople had done more than just murder an innocent woman. They had summoned a force they did not understand, a force that had used their hatred and fear as a gateway into this world. And her family had been at the center of it. She continued reading, her eyes scanning the frantic scribbles that filled the remaining pages. Her great-great-grandmother had been a part of the ritual to bind Margaret's spirit, to contain the curse within the woods. But in doing so, they had unleashed something else, an ancient entity that thrived on the town's fear and suffering. It was this entity that had twisted Margaret's curse into a living nightmare, feeding off the souls of those who ventured too close. She dropped the journal and stumbled back, her mind reeling. The entity was still here, bound to the land, feeding on the town's fear, and it had been using her family as its vessel, generation after generation. But why? Why her? The answer came to her in a flash of insight, a memory not her own, the moment when her ancestor had cast the final spell, sealing the curse and binding Margaret's spirit. Eleanor was not just a descendant, she was the reincarnation of Margaret Wainwright herself. Her soul had been reborn, over and over, as part of a cycle to keep the entity imprisoned. But with each rebirth, the entity grew stronger, corrupting the town and twisting its inhabitants into instruments of its will. Her legs gave out and she sank to the floor, the weight of the revelation crushing her. She was Margaret, and Margaret was her. The cries for justice, the whispers, they were not merely from a restless spirit, but from herself, from the part of her that remembered the injustice, the betrayal, and the darkness that had been unleashed. Eleanor's vision blurred as the room around her seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, forming grotesque shapes that loomed over her. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, merging into a cacophony of voices. She could hear Margaret's voice among them, clear and anguished. "You must end it. Break the cycle." The shadows coalesced into a figure, a dark silhouette that towered above her, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The entity had come, drawn by the awakening of her memories. It was no longer content to lurk in the woods, to feed on the edges of fear. It wanted her, needed her, to fully manifest its power. Eleanor forced herself to her feet, her mind racing. She could feel the entity's influence pressing down on her, trying to bend her will to its own. But now that she knew the truth, she could resist. She was not just Eleanor Marlowe. She was Margaret Wainwright, the rightful guardian of this land, and she had the power to end this once and for all. The entity lunged at her, a mass of darkness that filled the room. Eleanor grabbed the silver amulet, the one she had taken to the hollow, and held it up. The entity recoiled, hissing, as the amulet's light cut through the shadows. The whispers screamed in agony, a chorus of voices that shook the very foundations of the house. Eleanor felt a surge of power flow through her, not from the amulet, but from within herself. The memories, the pain, the injustice, they were all part of her, and they gave her strength. She spoke words she had not known she remembered, incantations in a language long forgotten. The room around her trembled, the shadows twisting and writhing as the entity fought against her will. "Be gone," she commanded, her voice ringing with authority. "You have no power here, not anymore." The entity roared, a sound that reverberated through the walls, the floors, the very air around her. It surged forward, a wave of darkness intent on consuming her. But Eleanor stood firm, her eyes locked onto the entity's glowing orbs. She felt the ancient power within her rise, a force that had lain dormant for centuries. With a final incantation, the amulet blazed with light, filling the room with a searing brightness. The entity shrieked, its form dissolving into smoke and shadows. The light expanded, pushing the darkness back, driving it into the corners of the room, out of the house, and back into the depths of the woods. The whispers faded, replaced by a silence that was no longer oppressive, but serene. The light dimmed, and Eleanor collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The room was still, the shadows gone. The entity had been banished, its hold over the town broken. But Eleanor knew this was not the end. The curse had been lifted, but the cost was yet to be paid. She could feel the pull of the hollow, the call of the ancient power that still lingered. She was both Eleanor and Margaret, the guardian and the sacrifice. And to truly free Black Hollow, she would have to confront the source of the darkness, the entity that lay at the heart of the hollow, waiting for its final reckoning. She stood slowly, the amulet warm in her hand, its glow now soft and steady. The battle was far from over, but she was ready. The truth had been revealed, and the path was clear. She would face the darkness, and this time she would end it, for Margaret, for herself, and for all the souls that had been lost to the entity's hunger. As she made her way to the front door, the night air rushed in, cold and sharp. The woods loomed in the distance, silent and foreboding. Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped outside, the amulet's light guiding her way. The hollow awaited, and with it, the final confrontation. The whispers were gone, but their message remained. Justice was not just an act, it was a promise that Eleanor intended to fulfill. The woods swallowed Eleanor as she stepped into the darkness, the cold, damp air clinging to her skin like a shroud. The path to Wainwright's hollow wound through the trees, a twisting, serpentine trail that seemed to lead her deeper into the heart of the ancient darkness that had claimed Black Hollow centuries ago. The whispers had gone silent, but their absence only amplified the tension. The sense that something watched her from every shadow, every rustling leaf. The amulet in her hand glowed softly, casting a pale light that barely pierced the oppressive gloom. It pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, a steady reminder of the power she carried within her. She was no longer just Eleanor Marlowe. She was Margaret Wainwright reborn, the last hope for a town gripped by darkness. The realization gave her strength, but it also weighed on her. This was not just her fight, it was the culmination of generations of fear, hatred, and suffering. As she approached the clearing of Wainwright's Hollow, the air grew colder. The trees around her seemed to bend and twist, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. In the center of the hollow, the ancient oak stood as it had in her visions, gnarled and blackened by the centuries. Its roots clawed at the earth, tangled and twisted, encircling the stone altar where Margaret had met her end. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This was the place where it all began and where it would all end. She stepped into the clearing and the air shifted, heavy and electric. The amulet flared brighter, its light cutting through the darkness. The ground beneath her feet trembled, a deep, rumbling vibration that reverberated through her bones. Eleanor felt a presence stirring, something vast and ancient, awakening in response to her arrival. From the shadows at the edge of the hollow, a figure emerged. It was not the formless mass of darkness she had seen before. This time it took shape, a tall, robed figure, its face obscured by a hood. The air around it warped and twisted, as if reality itself recoiled from its presence. Eleanor felt its gaze upon her, cold and unfeeling, a void that sought to consume everything in its path. "You have come," it intoned, its voice a hollow echo that reverberated through the hollow. "As you were always meant to." Eleanor's grip tightened on the amulet. "I know what you are," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "You are not Margaret's curse. You are the darkness that they unleashed to bind her." The figure's hooded head tilted slightly, a mockery of human curiosity. "I am what they made me. I am the hunger, the fear, the hate that fed on their souls, and now I will consume yours." The ground around Eleanor cracked, fissures spreading outward like the veins of a living organism. From the earth, shadows spilled forth, writhing tendrils that reached for her, seeking to drag her into the abyss. Eleanor raised the amulet, its light blazing against the encroaching darkness. The shadows hissed and recoiled, but the figure did not retreat. "You cannot defeat me," it hissed, its voice growing louder, more monstrous. "You are bound to me. Your death is inevitable." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the entity's power pressing down on her, a suffocating weight that threatened to crush her spirit. But amidst the fear, a memory surfaced, Margaret's final word in the flames. "Remember." Eleanor closed her eyes, reaching deep within herself to the part that was Margaret, the part that had been reborn again and again, trapped in this cycle of suffering. "I am not just Eleanor," she whispered. "I am Margaret Wainwright." The figure hesitated, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. Eleanor felt a surge of power flow through her, the memories of all her past lives merging into a singular force. She saw the truth, the ritual, the binding spell, the entity's true nature. It was a parasite born of the town's fear and hatred, twisted into being by the collective guilt of Black Hollow. And it had used her over and over to sustain itself. Eleanor opened her eyes, her gaze locking onto the figure. "You were never meant to be here," she said, her voice resonating with a power that was both hers and Margaret's. "You have no power over me." The figure shrieked, the sound tearing through the hollow like a gale. The shadows lunged at Eleanor, but she stood her ground. Raising the amulet high, she began to chant, the words of the counter-ritual she had seen in the journal, the incantation to break the cycle. The light from the amulet exploded outward, a blinding radiance that seared through the darkness. The ground beneath her split open, and a torrent of black smoke erupted from the earth, swirling around the figure. The entity writhed and twisted, its form dissolving in the light. Eleanor felt a pull, a force trying to drag her into the void with it. She gritted her teeth, pouring all her will into the incantation, the light, the power of the amulet. "Return to the void from which you came," she cried, her voice carrying over the roar of the darkness. The figure let out a final, agonized wail as it was torn apart, its essence pulled back into the fissures in the earth. The shadows recoiled, retreating into the cracks, which sealed themselves shut with a thunderous crash. The air cleared, the oppressive weight lifting as the hollow was flooded with a blinding, cleansing light. Eleanor fell to her knees, gasping for breath. The amulet, its glow now dimmed, lay heavy in her hand. Around her, the clearing was transformed, the trees no longer twisted and gnarled, but tall and ancient, their branches stretching upward to the night sky. The air was still, serene, as if the land itself was exhaling a sigh of relief. She had done it. The entity was gone. The cycle was broken. But at what cost? Eleanor felt a presence beside her and turned to see Margaret standing there, her form translucent, bathed in the light of the moon. Her eyes were no longer filled with anger or sorrow, but with a profound sense of peace. "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice a soft whisper that caressed Eleanor's ears. "You have set us free." Eleanor felt tears well in her eyes. "Is it over?" Margaret nodded. "For now, the darkness is banished, but remember, shadows always return with the setting sun. As long as fear and hatred exist, there will be those who seek to bring it back." Eleanor swallowed hard, the weight of Margaret's words settling over her. "What do I do now?" "You live," Margaret replied simply. "Live for the both of us. Remember what was lost and ensure that it is not repeated." Margaret's form began to fade, her outline dissolving into the moonlight. Eleanor watched, her heart aching with a bittersweet pain. As Margaret vanished, the last remnants of the darkness left the hollow, leaving behind only silence and the gentle rustle of the leaves. Eleanor stood, the amulet cool in her hand. The hollow was no longer a place of horror, but of peace. The ancient oak stood tall, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Eleanor walked to the tree and placed the amulet at its base, a final offering, a seal to keep the darkness at bay. As she turned to leave the hollow, the path back to her house lay clear and bathed in moonlight. The town would awaken tomorrow and the whispers would be gone. The people of Black Hollow would feel the change, the lifting of the weight that had hung over them for generations. They would not know the full truth, but they would know peace. Eleanor stepped into the woods, the light guiding her way. She felt a sense of closure, of finality, but also a whisper of something else, a reminder that the struggle against darkness is never truly over. She was free, but with that freedom came a responsibility. She would carry the memories, the knowledge of what lay beneath the surface of fear and hatred, and she would be ready should the darkness ever try to return. As she reached the edge of the woods, she paused, looking back at Wainwright's hollow one last time. The air was still, the land quiet, but deep within the silence, she thought she heard a faint whisper, soft, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of the leaves, a warning, a promise. Eleanor turned away, the weight of what she had faced settling into the background of her mind. She was not just Eleanor Marlowe, nor just Margaret Wainwright. She was both, and she would live with that duality, always vigilant, always watching. The hollow was at peace, but the world outside was not, and she would be there, ready to face whatever came next. With one last glance at the woods, Eleanor walked toward the town, the light of the amulet dimming as dawn began to break on the horizon.